In the heart of the divide, where the ground itself had turned against the living, a courier stood among the wreckage and spoke of things that hadn't happened yet. Ulysses warned about the bear and the bull tearing each other apart, about symbols outliving the men who carried them, about history repeating in the Mojave, whether anyone remembered the lesson or not. And here's what makes it unsettling. He was right. At Hoover Dam, the NCR and Legion collided, exactly as he'd described. At the Lucky 38, House's resurrection played out like Ulysses had written the script himself. Even the smaller details landed. The Brotherhood's isolation, the kings of Freeside clinging to dead world imagery, wastelanders building new civilizations on top of old ones, without understanding what they were standing on. One man in a gas mask had somehow predicted the shape of an entire region's future. It wasn't prophecy, not in the mystical sense. Ulysses didn't have visions or special powers. What he had was something the Mojave had forgotten how to do. He could read the patterns written into the wasteland itself, see where the old world's mistakes would surface again in the new one. But to understand how Ulysses could see the future, we have to go back to where he learned to read the past. Before the Legion, before the divide, before Ulysses became a name whispered in NCR camps, there was a tribe called the Twisted Hares. They made their home near the Grand Canyon, a community small enough that most wastelanders never heard of them, but sophisticated in ways that mattered. Their culture centered on a practice the old world would have called oral history, but with a physical component. They wove their stories into their hair. Each braid carried meaning, the pattern of the weave, the way strands crossed and recrossed, encoded events, relationships, lessons learned from survival and failure. A warrior's hair might show the battles they'd fought, the allies they'd lost, the territories they'd defended. An elder's braids could trace lineages back 3 generations, marking droughts and migrations, and the year the rad scorpions came down from the cliffs. It wasn't decoration. It was a physical record that traveled with you. This is where Ulysses learned to see connections that others missed. When you spend your childhood learning that every strand relates to every other strand, that the pattern only makes sense when you step back and see the whole weave, you start looking at the world the same way. Trade routes and tribal alliances, resource scarcity and factional conflict, they all followed patterns if you knew how to read them. That gift for reading patterns would be tested when Caesar's armies arrived at the Grand Canyon. The Legion didn't negotiate. They arrived at the Twisted Hares territory in 2273 with the same offer they'd made to 87 tribes before: join or die. Most tribes that resisted got crucified along the major roads as examples. The Twisted Hares, outnumbered and outgunned, made the practical choice. Ulysses was among those who took the Legion's mark, trading his tribe's name for a Latin one and his freedom for a place in Caesar's war machine. But here's where it gets complicated. Ulysses didn't just survive the assimilation, he excelled. The same pattern recognition that helped him read his tribe's history let him read battlefields. He could look at terrain and supply lines and predict where the NCR would be weak in 3 weeks. He understood that the Legion's strength wasn't just brutality, it was consistency. The same structure replicated across every camp from the Colorado to California. Within 2 years, he'd become one of Caesar's most effective scouts, trusted with reconnaissance deep into enemy territory. And that's where the conflict took root. Every mission for Caesar meant watching the Legion do to other tribes what they'd done to the Twisted Hares. Every victory meant seeing another culture's patterns erased, their braids cut, their stories reduced to footnotes in Caesar's grand narrative. Ulysses served efficiently, but he was also learning something the Legion didn't intend to teach him. Empires follow patterns too, and most of those patterns end in collapse. But serving Caesar meant witnessing something that would crack his faith in empires forever. In 2274, Caesar sent Ulysses ahead to scout Hoover Dam. The Legion needed intelligence before committing to a full assault, and Ulysses had proven himself capable of reading terrain, reading enemies, reading the invisible lines that decide battles before they're fought. What he found at the dam stopped him cold. Not the concrete itself, though it was the largest pre-war structure still standing in the Mojave. Not the NCR troops, though they numbered in the hundreds. It was what the dam represented. The NCR had crossed the Colorado, claimed the single greatest power source in the West, and planted their two-headed bear flag on a monument to old-world engineering that still worked. Ulysses reported back with detailed fortifications, troop counts, supply lines, but he also told Caesar something else. Whoever controlled the dam would control the future of the region, maybe the continent. It wasn't just about electricity or water. It was a symbol, powerful enough to unite or break nations, the kind of crossroads where history pivots. Caesar heard the tactical assessment and ordered the attack. The deeper warning went unheeded. While Caesar saw only a target, Ulysses saw a pattern repeating itself from before the bombs fell. Between campaigns, Ulysses started walking into places other legionaries avoided. Pre-war military bases with faded murals still clinging to bunker walls. Highway overpasses where road signs pointed to cities that no longer existed. Vaults sealed for 200 years, their experiments concluded in ways their designers never anticipated. He wasn't looting, he was reading. Every flag told him how a nation defined itself. Every highway showed him the roads empires used to stretch too far. Every vault revealed what happened when people put their faith in symbols and systems instead of each other. The NCR was rebuilding along the old interstate routes, reusing the old flags, even calling their expansion Manifest Destiny, like the nation that burned in atomic fire. The Legion claimed to be different, but Ulysses saw them following the same roads too. Caesar had studied the Romans, adopted their symbols, their rank structure, their territorial hunger. Different flag, same pattern. Empires rise by promising order, spread by building roads, and collapse when those roads carry the weight of too many mistakes. He started marking maps, cataloging the specific ways nations failed, not just that they fell, but how. The sequence, the signs, the moment when symbols became more important than the people living under them. But one place would teach him this lesson more brutally than any ruin. In 2277, following supply routes through the divide, Ulysses found something he hadn't seen since the Twisted Hares, a community that worked. The canyon settlement had no government, no flag, no grand ideology, just people trading between NCR territory to the west and Legion land to the east, keeping the old highway open because everyone benefited when goods moved freely. They called it the Divide because the canyon marked the border, but the name felt wrong to Ulysses. Nothing was divided here. Caravans flying NCR colors passed Legion scouts without incident. Traders spoke multiple languages, respected multiple customs, and somehow made it work without anyone enforcing unity at the point of a blade. The buildings were a mix of pre-war concrete and post-war ingenuity, storm-worn but maintained, lived in. This was the answer he'd been searching for in every ruin. Not a nation built on old-world symbols or military conquest, but something genuinely new, a culture that learned from the past without trying to resurrect it. They used the old roads without worshiping them. They traded with empires without joining them. For a man who'd spent years watching patterns of collapse, the divide represented a pattern of survival. Ulysses started visiting between Legion assignments, never officially, never wearing his markers. He listened to their stories, studied how they resolved disputes, how they built trust across old battle lines. For the first time since the Twisted Hares, he believed in something, and that made what came next so much worse. In 2277, a courier accepted a job from the Mojave Express. The package was marked for delivery to the Divide, routine freight hauling old-world tech that nobody thought twice about. Inside were pre-war transmitter devices, the kind scavengers found in government facilities, and sold for caps without asking questions. The courier delivered the package, collected payment, and moved on to the next job. They never opened it, never knew what the circuitry inside was designed to do. Ulysses was 200 miles away when it arrived, scouting NCR positions near the Colorado for Caesar's war machine. The transmitters activated automatically on arrival, broadcasting authentication codes on frequencies that hadn't been used in 200 years. Deep beneath the Divide's canyon floor, missile silo systems that had waited since 2077 recognized the signal. Launch protocols began cycling through their sequences, and pre-war fail-safes that were supposed to prevent accidental detonation had corroded away decades ago. But the Divide's location, built directly over missile silos, meant that one delivery would erase everything he'd hoped for. The warheads didn't launch. They detonated in place, still buried in their silos, and the explosion chain-reacted through the underground network. The canyon split open, entire sections of Highway 127 collapsing into the fissures as the bedrock fractured. Ulysses was 3 days' travel away when the sky turned white on the eastern horizon. By the time he reached the perimeter, the radiation storms had already started, cyclones of fallout spinning through the canyon where wind patterns used to carry the smell of juniper. The settlement was gone, not abandoned, but atomized. Homes, water purifiers, the council hall where former NCR and Legion had worked out their uneasy peace, all of it reduced to twisted metal and glass melted into the sand. He found bodies in the ruins, or what the blast had left of them, people he'd traded stories with just weeks before. The marked men would come later, mutated survivors trapped in their own ruined armor. But that first week, it was just silence and ash. Standing in the ashes, he realized the Courier hadn't just destroyed the Divide. They had proven his darkest theory correct. For years, Ulysses had studied how civilizations collapsed under symbols they couldn't control, flags they'd inherited from the old world. Now he'd watched it play out in real time. A courier, following established trade routes, delivering pre-war technology without understanding what it did. The exact same chain of blind trust and mechanical obedience that had launched the missiles in 2077. The NCR hadn't learned from the old world's mistakes. They'd franchised them. Their entire supply network relied on couriers who moved packages without questions, who treated launch codes like any other salvage. Caesar had built his legion to reject that kind of thinking, but his war machine still needed scouts who followed orders, who carried messages they didn't read. The Divide proved both systems produced the same result, people acting as instruments of destruction they couldn't see coming. Ulysses had been 200 miles away, unable to stop it, because he was serving as that same kind of instrument for Caesar. The settlement had thrived for 2 years before one delivery ended it, and nobody involved, from the Mojave Express dispatcher to the courier to Ulysses himself, had understood what they were participating in. But here's the detail that everyone missed at the time. The courier's ignorance was the point. Ulysses couldn't stop thinking about that courier. Not their name, not their face, but what they represented. Someone had walked a package across the Mojave, dropped it off, collected their caps, and moved on to the next job. Standard procedure. And in doing so, they'd erased a community of thousands without ever knowing it happened. He saw the Great War in that delivery. Technicians following launch protocols, soldiers manning silos, politicians authorizing retaliation. Every person in the chain doing their job, none of them understanding the full picture, all of them participating in the end of civilization. The Divide proved the pattern hadn't died with the old world. It had just found new instruments. The missile silos under the Divide hadn't launched in 2077. because someone at Hopeville Air Force Base had sealed them before the bombs fell. They'd stayed dormant for 200 years. Then a courier delivered a package containing an automated signal decoder. It activated dormant systems, and the warheads tore through their own home. History repeating, compressed into a single afternoon. That realization led him to a question that would shape everything he did next. Could someone who ended the world by accident be forced to understand what they'd done? Ulysses walked away from the Legion 3 months after the divide fell. No ceremony, no confrontation with Caesar, just a frumentarius who stopped reporting back. He'd served for 8 years, longer than most tribals survived the assimilation process, and he'd believed in what Caesar was building, a society that would last because it rejected the old world's mistakes. The divide taught him otherwise. Caesar had built an empire on the bones of 87 tribes, draping it in the symbols of Rome without understanding what made Rome collapse. The Legion banned technology to avoid the old world's fate, but Ulysses had watched that same old world technology erase a settlement while serving as Caesar's agent. The symbols were different, the pattern was identical. Caesar called himself the Son of Mars and wore the armor of a civilization that fell to its own hubris. He enslaved nations and called it unity. He burned libraries and called it strength. Ulysses had seen the real Roman roads, studied their aqueducts, read their philosophy in books Caesar would burn. The Legion was a cargo cult wearing a dead empire's skin. But leaving the Legion didn't mean abandoning his mission. It meant pursuing it alone. For the next year, Ulysses moved through the Mojave as a ghost. He worked 3 weeks for the followers of the apocalypse in Freeside, studying their attempts to rebuild old-world knowledge without repeating its weapons. He spent a month with the boomers at Nellis, watching them worship artillery they didn't understand. He even took contracts from the Mojave Express, the same company whose courier had destroyed the divide, delivering packages while tracking their routes. He was mapping the roads, not the physical ones, though he marked those too, but the patterns underneath. Who traded with whom? Which factions were expanding? Where resources flowed? The NCR's supply lines stretched 700 miles from the boneyard. Caesar's Legion controlled 4 states. Mr. House's Securitrons patrolled a 3-mile radius. Every faction was building toward something, following trajectories they thought were unique. Ulysses saw the same destination for all of them. The Legion would devour itself when Caesar died, like Rome after Augustus. The NCR would overextend until its roads collapsed, like Rome after Trajan. House would calcify into another petty tyrant, clinging to his monument. Different symbols, same cycle, and the Mojave would burn when they collided. The NCR would give him both proof his predictions were correct and confirmation of his worst fears about their future. Camp McCarran gave Ulysses a front-row seat to the NCR's institutional rot. The terminal logs told the real story. Supply lines stretched 700 miles back to California, requisition forms in triplicate for a single box of ammunition, officers more concerned with their post-war political careers than the soldiers dying at Nelson. He watched MPs shake down caravan traders while fiends encircled the airfield 2 miles north. The bureaucracy had metastasized into something unrecognizable from the Republic's founding principles. Colonel Shue meant well, but he was drowning in reports, while Lieutenant Boyd ran an interrogation room that would have made pre-war black site operators proud. Every decision required 6 signatures. Every tactical adjustment waited on a committee vote in Shady Sands. Ulysses had seen this exact pattern in Old World archives. The moment an institution grows too large to remember why it exists, it begins eating itself from the inside. The NCR soldiers still saluted the flag, still wore the bear proudly, but the symbols had become cargo cult rituals, divorced from their original meaning. They were mouthing words from a dead republic's playbook, while the real nation suffocated under its own weight. But it was at Camp Golf where he saw the NCR's future written in their present mistakes. The Rangers at Camp Golf were legends, the NCR's best, and Ulysses watched them lose a training exercise to recruits because they were too exhausted to think straight. These were veterans of the Brotherhood War, of Navarro, of a dozen campaigns, and they'd been deployed to the Mojave for 18 months without rotation. Their armor was held together with duct tape and prayers. Their sniper rifles had barrels worn smooth from overuse. Chief Hanlon understood what was happening, and that made it worse. Ulysses found the man's falsified reports in the system, inflating Legion casualties to buy time, trying to convince Shady Sands to pull back before the dam became a meat grinder. Hanlon knew the NCR couldn't win a second battle of Hoover Dam, not with supply lines this thin, not with troops this green. The Republic had pushed 500 miles past its logistical capacity and called it Manifest Destiny. Ulysses didn't need to guess the outcome. History had run this experiment 1,000 times. Rome overextending into Dacia, Napoleon in Russia, America in Vietnam. Empires don't collapse because they're conquered. They collapse because they hollow themselves out, chasing expansion. And one day, there's nothing left inside the uniform but exhaustion and broken promises. That was the NCR's pattern, but the Legion's was somehow even more predictable. Caesar had built his empire on Hegelian dialectics and brutal conquest, but Ulysses saw the flaw immediately. There was no succession plan because Caesar couldn't imagine a world where he wasn't the synthesis. The brain tumor growing in the Malpais legate's skull was just accelerating the inevitable. Every decision, every strategy, every ideological justification flowed through one man, and that man was dying. Lanius was a weapon, not a successor. Vulpes Inculta was a spy, not a statesman. Every other legate was a zealot who'd kill the others the moment Caesar stopped breathing. Ulysses had watched the Legion absorb 87 tribes, but they hadn't created a civilization. They'd created a personality cult, held together by fear and the myth of Caesar's invincibility. The moment that myth died, so did the Legion. The real irony was that Caesar thought he'd learned from Rome's mistakes. He'd read Gibbon, studied the crisis of the 3rd century, and concluded that Rome fell because it got soft. So he'd built an empire with no institutions, no bureaucracy, no civic identity beyond obedience to Caesar himself. He'd misdiagnosed the patient and prescribed exactly the wrong cure. Rome survived for centuries after Augustus because of its institutions. The Legion would fracture within months, maybe weeks, and the tribes would return to their old names and old wars as if Caesar had never existed. 2 empires, 2 death sentences already written, but there was a third power in the Mojave he hadn't accounted for. Robert House had survived the apocalypse by turning himself into a machine, his body sustained in a stasis chamber beneath the Lucky 38, while his mind ran New Vegas like a pre-war corporation. Ulysses watched the Strip from a distance, saw the restored casinos glowing with electric light, the Securitrons enforcing order on the streets. It was a perfect reconstruction of old-world excess, neon and caps and carefully managed vice. House called it civilization, but Ulysses saw it for what it was, a monument, a mausoleum dressed in lights, where the dead world's ghost refused to accept it had ended. House had preserved the Strip exactly as it was in 2077, down to the architecture, the currency, the entire economic system. He wasn't building something new. He was embalming the corpse of Vegas and pretending it still breathed. The tribe's house had civilized. The 3 families wore pre-war suits and spoke pre-war slang, playing roles in a theater production that had no audience left to appreciate it. House had given them new names, new identities, but Ulysses knew those were just costumes over the same tribal violence that had always ruled the wasteland. But House's real mistake wasn't living in the past. It was believing he could control the future. Beneath Fortification Hill, hidden in a bunker the Legion used as a stronghold without understanding what lay below, House had stored his insurance policy. An army of Mark II Securitrons, hundreds of them, inactive and waiting. Ulysses had pieced it together from Brotherhood reports, from whispers among House's own people, from the power requirements House kept calculating for Hoover Dam. The dam wasn't just about keeping the lights on in New Vegas. It was about activation. House needed that reactor at full capacity to wake his army, to upgrade every Securitron on the Strip to military-grade combat platforms. Once he had that power, he'd move fast, expand his territory, enforce his vision of order, build his autocratic technocracy across the Mojave and beyond. It would work too, for a while. House had the intelligence, the resources, the strategic advantage of 200 years of preparation. But it would still be one man's will imposed on the wasteland by force. The same recipe for collapse the old world had perfected. One bullet, one malfunction, one variable House hadn't predicted in his equations, and the whole structure would crumble. 3 factions, 3 futures, and every one of them a repetition of the mistakes that ended civilization the first time. Ulysses began to map it like an equation. Hoover Dam was the fulcrum, the power source every faction needed to execute their vision. The NCR wanted it to sustain their expansion, to prove their republic could tame the wasteland. The Legion wanted it to break the NCR's spine and water the Mojave with their blood. House wanted it to activate his army and lock the region under his eternal rule. But the dam alone couldn't determine the outcome. There were too many variables converging on the Mojave in 2281. The boomers at Nellis Air Force Base, with their artillery and their bomber. The Brotherhood chapter, hiding in Hidden Valley, with their technology and their zealotry. The 3 families on the Strip, loyal to House, but still wearing tribal skin beneath their suits. The Kings in Freeside, the Khans in Red Rock, the independent settlements scattered across the desert. Each one a potential catalyst, a factor that could tip the balance. Ulysses watched them all, tracked their movements, predicted how they'd align when the Legion finally marched on the dam. He saw the patterns forming, the same cycles of violence and power that had played out across the wasteland since the bombs fell. 4 possible endings, 4 different paths forward, and all of them leading to the same destination. But the most important variable wasn't any faction, it was the Courier themselves. Ulysses didn't just wait in the divide, he traveled, he watched. After the Courier crawled out of that grave in Goodsprings, Ulysses began tracking their movements across the Mojave, staying just out of sight, but close enough to see the ripples they left behind. He saw them walk into Prim and decide who'd run the town. He watched them broker deals in Novak, clear out Nipton's ruins, and stand at the gates of New Vegas, deciding which faction deserved their loyalty. Each settlement the Courier touched changed in some small way, and Ulysses cataloged every shift. What fascinated him wasn't the Courier's combat skill or their charm. It was their pattern of decision-making. They didn't follow orders cleanly. They adapted, improvised, and most importantly, they had the singular ability to make choices that stuck. When the Courier solved a problem, it stayed solved. Every choice the Courier made confirmed what Ulysses had suspected. They were the one person who could end the cycle or repeat it forever. Ulysses wasn't guessing. He had a framework. He studied 3 layers of reality that most people in the wasteland ignored: symbols, resources, and pressure points. Symbols first: flags, monuments, roads, old world relics. He knew that people rally around symbols even when those symbols contradict their material interests. The NCR's 2-headed bear represented expansion and democracy, but it also represented overreach. Caesar's bull represented strength and unity. but it concealed a cult of personality with no succession plan. House's Lucky 38 represented control and vision, but it isolated him from the people he claimed to protect. Resources second: water rights, power grids, trade routes, and Brahmin caravans. Ulysses mapped who controlled what, who needed what, and where the supply lines were stretched thinnest. The NCR needed Hoover Dam's electricity to justify their expansion. The Legion needed the dam's symbolism to prove they could conquer the West. House needed both to power his vision of New Vegas as an independent city-state. Pressure points third. He watched how factions responded when tested. The NCR buckled under bureaucracy. The Legion cracked without Caesar's direct oversight. House's Securitrons were only as flexible as their programming allowed. That framework let him predict the Second Battle of Hoover Dam's outcome months before it happened. The math was straightforward. The Legion was unified under one man, which made them fast and decisive. But if Caesar fell, the entire structure would collapse into warlordism within a year. The NCR was strong on paper, with thousands of troops and old-world tech, but they were fighting a war 400 miles from home, with supply lines that bled resources and morale daily. House had prepared for this exact moment for over 200 years. His Securitron army was hidden under the fort, his plan was airtight, and his calculations accounted for every variable. Except one: he couldn't predict human chaos. He couldn't account for a courier who refused to be a pawn. Ulysses saw the battle's outcome as a simple equation. Whoever the courier sided with would win, not because the courier was some superhuman fighter, but because they were the chaos variable that disrupted every faction's plan. The NCR assumed the courier would fall in line. The Legion assumed they could be broken or bought. House assumed they could be controlled with contracts and caps. But predicting the battle was easy. Predicting what would come after was where his real insight showed. If the courier sided with the NCR, Ulysses saw victory at the dam, followed by slow rot. The Republic would hold the Mojave for maybe 5 years, perhaps 10 if they were lucky. But every mile of new territory meant thinner supply lines, more bureaucrats skimming caps, more senators back in shady sands, arguing over budgets, while troopers went without ammunition. He'd watched it happen before. The hub's merchants would demand protection they never paid for. Brahmin barons in Reading would bribe their way out of taxes, while farms in the boneyard starved. NCR citizens in the core region would vote to abandon the Mojave the moment it cost them personally, and no treaty or constitution would stop them. Within a generation, the NCR would face the same collapse as the Old World. Too big to govern, too corrupt to reform, too democratic to act decisively when crisis came. The Mojave would be the stone that broke the bear's back, and Ulysses knew it the moment he saw their overstretched camps and underfed troops. The Legion's future was even bleaker, though they didn't know it yet. If Caesar's Legion won the dam, they'd paint the Colorado red with NCR blood and drag thousands back to Arizona in chains. Lanius would lead the assault personally, and the Mojave would become just another piece of Caesar's growing empire for exactly 3 months. Because Caesar's brain tumor wasn't a secret to someone who'd walked with the Legion, Ulysses knew the headaches, the rage, the moments where the son of Mars lost his train of thought mid-sentence. The autodoc in the fort could buy time, but without the courier's intervention, Caesar would die within the year. The Civil War would start before they burned his body. Lanius had the army, but no vision beyond conquest. Vulpes Inculta had the Frumentari, but no legions to command. Lucius, Aurelius, Canyon Runner, every legate with 500 men would see their chance. The empire built on one man's will would shatter the moment that will went dark. House's victory would be cleaner, but no less doomed. If Mr. House secured the dam, his Securitron army would turn New Vegas into the most fortified city-state in the wastes within 36 hours. Every casino would run like clockwork. Every cap would be accounted for. The Strip would gleam under his absolute control, exactly as he'd planned for 200 years. And it would never change. House's vision was a photograph, not a living thing. He'd preserve Vegas as a monument to pre-war glory, scrubbed clean of anything that didn't fit his aesthetic. No tribals building new traditions, no communities growing organically, no future that he hadn't personally designed in 2077. Ulysses had seen it in House's projections and treaties, a city frozen in amber, ruled by a man who'd already died once and refused to let history move on without him. Efficient, yes. Safe, probably, but sterile as a vault sealed for eternity, where humanity could survive but never actually live. But there was a fourth option, one that terrified and fascinated him in equal measure. The independent ending. The Courier takes control of the Securitron army, kicks out every faction, and rules the Mojave alone. Ulysses saw it clearly. Immediate chaos. No bureaucracy to process water rights. No Legion discipline to keep the roads clear. Just one person and an army of robots trying to hold together a region the size of pre-war Nevada. Short-term? Disaster. Freeside would burn, caravans would get picked off, and every two-bit warlord with a pipe rifle would test the new boss. But long-term, Ulysses saw something the other three endings couldn't offer. Genuine possibility. The NCR would always be the NCR, corrupt and slow. The Legion would always be the Legion, brutal and brittle. House would always be House, frozen in 2077. But an independent Mojave? That was a blank slate. No old-world baggage, no predetermined path, no inevitability. It could become anything. It could fail spectacularly, sure, collapse into 100 warring settlements, or it could build something that didn't just repeat history with a fresh coat of paint. That possibility, that the Courier could break the cycle, was why he refused to simply kill them in the Divide. The Divide wasn't a trap, it was a test. Ulysses had spent years there, after the Courier's delivery triggered the detonation, walking through the ruins of the community they'd accidentally destroyed. He salvaged EDE, reprogrammed the missile silos, and waited. He could have launched immediately, erased both the Bear and the Bull with nuclear fire before the battle for Hoover Dam even started. But he needed to know if the Courier understood what they'd done. If they could walk through the Divide, see the crater where Hopeville used to stand, recognize their own role in its destruction, and actually learn from it. That capacity for understanding, for growth, for acknowledging consequences without breaking, that was the variable he couldn't predict from a distance. If the Courier learned, then maybe, just maybe, they could carry that lesson back to the Mojave and make a different choice than every other wasteland warlord. If they didn't learn, if they shrugged it off or blamed someone else, or refused to see, then he'd launch every missile in the Divide and let the Mojave die with its old-world ambitions. But to understand why he believed a conversation in the Divide could change the Mojave's entire future, we have to examine the philosophy behind his predictions. Ulysses believed civilizations were built on symbols, not resources or armies or technology, but the shared meanings people carried in their heads. The NCR's two-headed bear represented old-world democracy, which meant it also carried old-world corruption, expansion, and eventual collapse. The Legion's bull represented Rome, which meant it carried Caesar's autocracy, his brutality, and the certainty that it would fracture the moment he died. Even Mr. House's neon Vegas was a symbol, the promise of pre-war luxury and order frozen in time like a museum exhibit. These weren't just flags and logos, they were frameworks that determined what people thought was possible, what goals they pursued, what mistakes they'd inevitably repeat. The old world had fallen because its symbols, progress and manifest destiny, and atomic confidence led it straight off a cliff. New symbols could mean a new world, a community that built its identity around something other than empires and casinos and nuclear weapons might actually create something different. That's what the divide had been before the Courier's package detonated the warheads underneath it. A place with its own symbol, its own meaning. Something growing in the Mojave that didn't copy the past. And the Courier had destroyed it without even knowing it existed. But symbols alone weren't enough. He also studied the roads that connected them. For Ulysses, roads weren't just infrastructure. They were the arteries of civilization, carrying trade, ideology, and power. The old world fell when its roads crumbled, when supply lines broke and communities turned inward. He saw the same principle in the Mojave. The I-15 determined NCR expansion. Route 95 fed Legion supply lines, and whoever controlled the roads to Hoover Dam controlled the war. Physical paths shaped political outcomes. But there were metaphorical roads, too. The path a nation walked, the trajectory it followed. The NCR walked the old world's road toward bureaucracy and overextension. The Legion walked Rome's road toward autocratic collapse. And the Courier, by choosing which literal roads to travel and which to destroy, decided which metaphorical road the Mojave would follow. Roads connect places, but history connects events, and that's where his predictions became most precise. Ulysses didn't believe in fate. He believed in patterns. The old world collapsed because democracies grew corrupt, militaries overstretched, and ideologies calcified. 200 years later, the NCR's Senate was gridlocked, their supply lines stretched to Nevada, their principles compromised by Brahmin barons. The Legion mirrored Alexander's empire. Charismatic warlord, rapid conquest, no succession plan. Caesar had a brain tumor and no heir. When he died, the Legion would fracture exactly as Macedonia did, warlords carving up territories, the dream collapsing into civil war. House embodied the old world oligarchs who thought technology could solve human nature. Robco, Westtech, Vaulttech, all built empires on the assumption that control systems could replace wisdom, all burned in nuclear fire. House was building the same trap in Vegas, brilliant and blind in the exact same way. That philosophy made him dangerous, because if he was right, he could predict not just the Mojave, but the entire post-war world's trajectory. His predictions scaled beyond the dam. The NCR would collapse within 50 years, strangled by the same expansionism that killed Rome. Territory they couldn't govern, citizens they couldn't feed, enemies on every border. The Mojave was just the beginning of their overreach. The Legion would fragment within 5 years of Caesar's death. Maybe 10 if Lanius held it together through pure brutality. But eventually, the warlords would turn on each other, and the tribes would remember they were tribes. No ideology survives the death of its prophet when there's no institution to carry it forward. House's Vegas would calcify into something sterile and small, an enclave of prosperity surrounded by wasteland, hoarding pre-war tech while humanity struggled outside the walls. Stability without growth, order without meaning. Another Vaulttech experiment that mistook survival for living. The Mojave was the fulcrum where these futures intersected. Whoever won the dam would set the pattern for the next century. That's why Ulysses watched the Courier so carefully. But the most chilling prediction he made wasn't about empires. It was about individual people. Ulysses saw the Courier as something rare in the wasteland. Not a believer in the NCR's two-headed bear, not a true son of Caesar, not even loyal to Mr. House's vision of old-world resurrection. The Courier was a survivor who bent with the wind, took on the color of whatever faction paid them, walked away when the job was done. That adaptability made them dangerous. Ulysses knew the Courier could broker peace at Hoover Dam or burn it all down, could install House as dictator or destroy him, could hand the Mojave to the NCR or let Caesar's Legion crucify it, all equally possible. The Courier had no ideology to anchor them, just a pragmatic willingness to see any plan through. Which meant they were either the one person who could break the cycle of empires rising and falling, or the perfect tool to perpetuate it forever. Ulysses bet everything on forcing the Courier to choose consciously, instead of drifting from contract to contract. Make them think about consequences before pulling the trigger. He saw that same adaptability in other key figures, and predicted their choices with eerie accuracy. Take Benny. Ulysses never met the chairman leader, but he knew the type. Small-time tribal who got a taste of pre-war luxury, learned to wear a suit, started thinking he was smarter than the 200-year-old genius who gave him that suit in the first place. Ulysses predicted Benny would betray House the moment he got his hands on real power. The platinum chip was that power, a device that could upgrade the Lucky 38's Securitrons, turn Mr. House's army from peacekeepers into an unstoppable force. Benny would see it, want it, and convince himself he deserved it more than his boss. Small minds with big power always overreach. Benny would shoot the Courier in the head to steal the chip, then bungle the aftermath, because he didn't understand what he'd stolen. He'd hide in his casino, waiting for House's revenge. But House wouldn't be the problem. The Courier would crawl out of that grave, track Benny across the Mojave, and corner him in the tops. Ulysses saw it all: the betrayal, the hubris, the reckoning. Joshua Graham was another figure whose future Ulysses saw written in his past. The burned man, Malpius Legate, Caesar's first right hand, the missionary who became a conqueror. The Legion covered him in pitch, set him on fire, threw him into the Grand Canyon after he lost the first battle of Hoover Dam. Caesar made an example of failure. Ulysses knew Joshua Graham didn't die in that canyon. Men fueled by faith and vengeance don't die easily, and Graham had both in excess. He'd survive, return to his old home in Zion, rebuild himself in the image of Old Testament wrath. The tribes there would call him a legend. He'd teach them to fight, prepare them for Caesar's inevitable return. But Ulysses also saw further. Graham would never find peace as long as he believed his holy war was righteous. Only when forced to see the cost, to watch innocents suffer for his principles, would he have a chance to become something other than Caesar's monster in a different skin. The Courier would be the one to take him there, to Zion, to that confrontation with himself. Whether Graham chose mercy or slaughter would determine if he stayed a burned man or became human again. But his most unsettling prediction involved someone he had never met, Christine Royce. Christine Royce wasn't someone Ulysses ever spoke to. He never knew her name, her face, or her mission, but he predicted her path with disturbing accuracy. He knew the Brotherhood of Steel would eventually send a team to the Sierra Madre once rumors of pre-war technology reached the Mojave chapter. He knew they'd be trapped, not by the cloud or the holograms, but by the casino's real defense, the promise of something worth dying for. Most would die quickly. One would survive long enough to matter. That survivor would be driven by something stronger than orders or ideology. Love, specifically. A need to find someone that kept them breathing when suffocation should have won. And they'd only escape when another wanderer arrived, someone carrying their own ghosts, someone capable of seeing past the trap to the people still caught inside. Ulysses understood patterns of obsession and rescue because he'd watched them repeat across the Mojave. Father Elijah himself was one of Ulysses's most precise predictions, and the most tragic. Elijah's path was written in every choice he made at Helios 1. When the NCR pushed the Brotherhood out in 2275, most elders would have retreated, regrouped, adapted. Elijah sent his paladins into a massacre, trying to hold a solar weapon he barely understood. Ulysses knew that kind of desperation didn't vanish with defeat. It metastasized. He predicted Elijah would drift east, chasing pre-war technology powerful enough to reverse his failures. The Sierra Madre's hologram and cloud research would become his obsession, the way Helios had been. But this time, there'd be no chapter to lose, no paladins to spend, just himself and the growing certainty that one more weapon, one more system mastered, would let him wipe the slate clean. The old man would try to weaponize the cloud, turn the casino into a fortress, and broadcast death across the Mojave until everyone who'd wronged him was gone, and he'd never leave. His greed wouldn't let him. The Sierra Madre would become his tomb, whether he died trying to control it or was sealed inside by someone strong enough to walk away. Elijah embodied everything Ulysses warned against, a man strangling the future to resurrect a past that never worked. The think tank presented a different kind of pattern, not ambition, but inhuman logic. Big MT's scientists had solved a problem Ulysses saw everywhere in the old world ruins. They'd answered the question of how to live forever. Then, they'd forgotten why anyone would want to. He knew their kind, these men who'd carved out their brains and replaced blood with electricity, believing consciousness could survive without flesh. By 2281, they'd been running experiments for 200 years. But somewhere in those centuries, they'd stopped asking what the experiments were for. They'd test, record, repeat. They'd observe the same data loops, have the same conversations, pursue the same projects they'd already completed decades earlier. Science as ritual, stripped of purpose. Ulysses predicted they'd remain locked in that state until an outside force broke the cycle, or their systems finally degraded past function. They couldn't destroy themselves because they'd forgotten destruction was possible. They couldn't escape because they'd engineered away the human need for anything beyond the next test. The most dangerous thing about the think tank wasn't their technology. It was their proof that you could remove everything that made you human and still keep walking, talking, laughing at jokes you no longer understood. But the most complex prediction he made involved Colonel Royes and the white legs in Zion. Ulysses tracked the pieces. Caesar wanted Salt Lake City. The white legs wanted into the Legion. The new Canaanites held Zion Canyon between them. Remove the obstacle, the Legion moves north. The white legs get their red banner. Everyone gets what they want. He predicted Joshua Graham would return, not because Graham wanted redemption, but because the burned man couldn't let New Canaan die twice. Daniel would preach evacuation. Graham would sharpen his axes. The dead horses and sorrows would be caught between mercy and survival. The pattern was old. Violence answers violence until the cycle breaks or everyone's dead. Ulysses predicted the white legs would slaughter New Canaan's refugees at the river crossing. He predicted Graham would retaliate by exterminating every white leg in the canyon. He predicted Daniel would have to choose whether saving the tribes meant keeping their innocence or teaching them to kill. Each of these predictions proved true, but they were only practice for the big one. Hoover Dam. The NCR would fortify the eastern approach, mine the spillways, position 1st Recon on the cliffs. They'd hold the dam itself with 600 troops and spread another 2,000 across Camp Gulf, McCarran, and the outposts. Overextended, undermanned, waiting for reinforcements that wouldn't arrive in time. The Legion would commit everything. Lanius would throw 1,200 legionaries at the dam's eastern gates, while Frumentarii sabotaged the monorail and hit the NCR's rear positions. Caesar's tumor would force the assault early, before supply lines were secured. Desperation, dressed as confidence. House would wait, let both sides bleed, then deploy the Securitrons upgraded with the Platinum Chips firmware. 3 combat models per destroyed Mark I, self-repairing, networked targeting. Overwhelming force, held until the moment it mattered most. And the Courier would break the stalemate, not by fighting in the battle, but by choosing which side won, or burning all 3 flags at once. Ulysses had walked the same roads, made the same choices, knew exactly which levers the Courier would pull. But predicting the battle was only half the work. Predicting the aftermath required understanding what each faction would become afterward. If the NCR won at Hoover Dam, Ulysses predicted collapse within 5 years. Victory would justify every mistake. Kimball would claim a mandate, push deeper into the Mojave, spread troops even thinner. Brahmin barons would carve up New Vegas. Cassandra Moore would execute suspected collaborators, and nobody would notice the treasury emptying until the caps stopped flowing. The NCR's problem wasn't losing. It was winning without learning anything. They'd won Hoover Dam before, in 2274, and it taught them expansion worked. Another victory would teach them expansion worked bigger. They'd be in Arizona by 2286, broke and overextended, shooting civilians who couldn't pay taxes they didn't understand. But if they lost, forced back to California, Kimball impeached, the whole republic asking how they poured 4 years and 10,000 lives into a desert and came home with nothing, that kind of loss could save them. Contraction, reform, remembering what a republic actually was before it rotted into an empire wearing a bear. Ulysses saw the irony. The best thing for the NCR was losing just badly enough to survive the lesson. The Legion's transformation would be far more violent. Caesar's tumor wasn't a variable in Ulysses's calculation. It was a clock. Victory at the dam might buy the legate a few extra months, maybe a year. Confidence and purpose can keep a dying man upright longer than medicine. But the brain lesion would do its work regardless of how many NCR flags burned. The civil war afterwards wouldn't be a clean succession. Lanius was a weapon, not a statesman. Lucius commanded the Praetorians, but lacked the charisma to hold the tribes. Volpes had the intelligence network, but too many enemies among the old guard, who still believed in honest battle. Each would have a claim. None would have legitimacy. Ulysses saw the map redrawing itself in blood. Arizona would fracture first, then New Mexico, then everything Caesar had welded together through sheer force of personality. Warlords carving kingdoms from Legion territory, each one convinced he carried the true vision forward. The Colorado would run red for a decade. House's transformation was different, not evolution, but crystallization. If House secured the dam, Ulysses predicted something closer to expansion than conquest. The Securitron army would establish a technocratic sphere, radiating outward from the Strip. Towns within a 100-mile radius would receive an offer. Accept House's security apparatus in exchange for water, power, and protection. Most would accept. The alternative would be raiders and starvation. It'd work for a while. House's efficiency was genuine. Trade routes would stabilize. Infrastructure would return. Pre-war technology would filter down through carefully controlled channels. But every decision would flow through one 261-year-old brain in a life support chamber, and House didn't tolerate debate. He tolerated compliance. Eventually, someone would refuse the offer. A community that wanted to govern itself, make its own mistakes, chart its own course. House would deploy Securitrons to correct the inefficiency, and the resentment would metastasize, one forced compliance at a time, until the Mojave had a working power grid and a growing insurgency that wanted freedom over functional streetlights. Only the independent path remained genuinely unpredictable, which is why Ulysses was drawn to it. Ulysses admitted he couldn't see the shape of an independent Mojave, not because his method failed, but because independence meant shattering every existing pattern the wasteland knew. No manifest destiny pushing west, no slavery expanding east, no autocrat optimizing from above, just the Courier, the Securitrons, and 100 communities that'd have to figure out what comes next. It could become a stable confederation, towns cooperating because cooperation worked better than competition. It could fracture into a warlord state, the Securitrons enforcing the Courier's will until someone stronger came along. It could birth something entirely new, a form of governance the old world never imagined, and the new world hadn't dared to try. The variables multiplied faster than Ulysses could track them. Every choice the Courier made would cascade differently, without a faction's ideology as a guardrail. Help Freeside and you create expectations. Ignore Freeside and you create resentment. Secure Hoover Dam and you inherit its maintenance costs, its strategic vulnerabilities, its legacy as a symbol people would kill for. That uncertainty was exactly what convinced him the Courier had to make their choice consciously, understanding its weight. So Ulysses designed a confrontation. He'd activate the missile systems in the Divide, arm warheads still aimed at NCR and Legion territory, and then wait. The Courier would come. He was certain of that, and when they arrived, he'd give them a choice: stop the launch or let it fly. The missiles themselves weren't really the point. What mattered was the conversation that would follow. Ulysses would force the Courier to articulate why they chose what they chose, to defend their answer with more than reflex or convenience. He'd ask them what they were building, what they were protecting, what symbol they'd planted their flag on. If the Courier could answer those questions with clarity and conviction, if they'd learned to think beyond the moment and see the weight of their actions, then the Divide would have served its purpose. The student would have surpassed the teacher. If they couldn't, if they fumbled or deflected or fell back on excuses, then Ulysses would know his predictions were correct, and the cycle would continue. The whole plan hinged on reading the Courier's patterns, on understanding how they'd react under pressure when their philosophy was stripped bare. But there was one variable even Ulysses couldn't fully account for: EDE. The little iBot had no strategic value. It was a broken piece of pre-war tech the Courier repaired in Prim, a hovering companion that beeped and chirped and occasionally marked enemies on your HUD. Ulysses watched this relationship carefully because it didn't fit his models. EDE couldn't carry supplies, couldn't negotiate, couldn't open doors or hack terminals. The robot offered companionship and nothing else. So why did the Courier fix it? Why haul a damaged iBot across the Mojave when Boone or Veronica or Arcade could contribute far more to survival? Ulysses studied every interaction. Did the Courier repair EDE from genuine compassion, a small act of kindness toward something broken and alone? Or was it completionist instinct, the player habit of saying yes to every quest marker, ticking boxes without thought? The difference mattered, because one implied the Courier could break patterns through irrational empathy, while the other suggested they were still sleepwalking through the wasteland. He replayed his own memories of finding iBots in the old world, messengers carrying propaganda across battlefields, discarded when their broadcasts ended. The Courier had turned one into a friend. That question, whether the Courier's kindness was genuine or transactional, became the test for whether his philosophy was complete. Because Ulysses had found the one thing his pattern reading couldn't predict: genuine selfless compassion that expects no reward. Helping Freeside squatters who'd never know your name, sharing water with a beggar outside the strip, repairing a robot just because it seemed lonely. These acts don't follow patterns because they're irrational. They cost resources and time for zero strategic gain. But irrational actions can break cycles. If the Courier genuinely cared about people who couldn't help them back, if they made choices based on something other than power or survival or ideology, then maybe they could build something different. Maybe the new Vegas they shaped wouldn't just be another doomed nation stamped with a fresh flag. Ulysses had spent years mapping cause and effect, predicting futures from the debris of the past. He could forecast what an NCR Ranger would do, what a Legion Centurion would choose, how House's algorithms would respond. But he couldn't model mercy. He couldn't predict the moment someone decides to help, for no reason except that it's right. That gap in his theory was either proof the Courier could transcend history or proof that small kindnesses were just noise in the data, statistical outliers that didn't matter when missiles launched and nations burned. But if the Courier couldn't demonstrate that compassion, then Ulysses's backup plan would activate. The Divide still held 6 functional ICBM silos, pre-war relics that had survived the initial exchange and 200 years of decay. Ulysses had spent months repairing the targeting systems, rerouting power from Hopeville's weather station, bypassing safeties that were meant to prevent exactly what he was planning. The missiles were aimed at 2 targets: the Long 15, the NCR's primary supply highway connecting California to the Mojave, and Dry Wells, the Legion's forward staging camp east of the Colorado. Launch both, and you didn't just kill soldiers, you severed arteries. The NCR's entire war effort depended on convoys rolling up the 15, bringing ammunition, food, reinforcements from shady sands. The Legion's eastward expansion relied on Dry Wells as a logistics hub, a place where centurions gathered before crossing into new territory. Cut those lines, and both empires would bleed out over months, forced to retreat, reorganize, abandon the Mojave entirely. What remained would be isolation, a power vacuum where neither flag could fly. In that void, Ulysses believed something new could take root, something that learned from old-world mistakes instead of repeating them. The missiles were insurance, a way to force the reset if the Courier failed to transcend their pattern. That threat made the Courier's journey to the Divide inevitable, which was exactly what Ulysses wanted. Ulysses didn't send a formal letter. He sent fragments, cryptic transmissions routed through EDE, the iBot the Courier repaired in Prim, audio logs left in abandoned camps, graffiti on canyon walls that only someone traveling specific routes would see. Each message was a breadcrumb, vague enough to spark curiosity, but concrete enough to suggest a larger pattern. He knew the Courier would come because he'd studied their history across the Mojave. They didn't leave mysteries unsolved. They didn't ignore threats, even abstract ones. Every terminal they hacked, every vault they explored, every stranger's problem they solved, it all pointed to the same compulsion, the need to understand, to finish what was started. Ulysses had read their pattern the same way he'd read the NCR's expansion or the Legion's doctrine. The trap wasn't force, it was curiosity itself, the promise of answers about the Divide, about what the Courier had unknowingly destroyed, about why Ulysses knew their name. He baited the hook with the one thing a Courier couldn't resist, a delivery left incomplete, a message that demanded a reply. But the Courier's journey to the Divide would be dangerous, and that danger was deliberate, another test. The Divide wasn't just ruins. It was a gauntlet, 50 square miles of collapsed overpasses, radiation storms that could peel skin, and creatures that had adapted to conditions that should have been uninhabitable. Death claws nested in the wreckage of apartment complexes. Tunnelers, blind subterranean predators, surfaced in packs when they sensed vibrations. And then there were the marked men, former NCR and Legion soldiers fused into their armor by radiation, kept alive by hatred and pain, attacking anything that moved. Ulysses had walked this same path and survived. He expected the Courier to do the same, not because the journey was fair, but because fairness wasn't the point. If the Courier gave up, turned back, decided the risk wasn't worth the answers, then they weren't ready to shape the Mojave's future. If they pressed forward, adapted, endured, they'd proven they had the strength his predictions required, the resilience to carry a symbol and not break under its weight. The Divide was a crucible by design. Every collapsing building forced a choice between safety and progress. Every firefight drained resources, tested resolve. Ulysses wanted the Courier exhausted, pushed to their limit, stripped of comfort, so that when they finally reached the missile silos, the confrontation would be raw, honest, unfiltered by Mojave politics or faction loyalty. Every marked man the Courier fought had been a lesson in what happens when symbols lose meaning. The marked men weren't ghouls, not in the traditional sense. They were NCR troopers and Legion soldiers caught in the warhead detonations, their skin flayed by radiation and wind, their bodies kept alive by the Divide's twisted atmosphere. They couldn't heal, couldn't die, and couldn't remember who they'd been before the blast. But they still wore their uniforms. Tattered NCR armor on one corpse, Legion bull insignia on another, both trying to kill each other in the ruins. They didn't know why. The ideology was gone, the nations were gone, the reasons were gone. All that remained was the pattern. See the enemy uniform. Attack. Ulysses had watched them for years, these hollow soldiers reenacting a war neither side could articulate. To him, they were the clearest proof that symbols don't need meaning to control behavior. A flag, a uniform, a piece of cloth stitched with thread becomes a command that survives the death of every ideal it once represented. The Courier had to fight through dozens of them, each one a monument to loyalty, without purpose, violence without memory. But the marked men were only the first symbol the Courier would have to interpret in the Divide. Between the ruined overpasses and collapsed bunkers, flags hung in the wind, NCR bear banners tangled in rebar, Legion bulls torn and fading in the dust, all of them half buried under concrete and ash. Ulysses had left them exactly where they'd fallen when the Divide died. These weren't trophies, they were evidence. Every flag had been carried by a soldier who believed it meant protection, order, civilization. Every flag had been present when the warheads launched, when the Courier's delivery activated the dormant silos and turned the Divide into a wind-carved grave. The symbols hadn't saved anyone. Ulysses wanted the Courier to see this, the gap between what a flag promises and what it delivers when the missiles fly. The NCR's two-headed bear didn't stop the detonation. The Legion's bull didn't protect its scouts. Both factions sent people to die in the Divide, and both factions' symbols were now just fabric, rotting in irradiated wind. He'd arranged the path deliberately, ensuring the Courier would pass flag after flag, each one a reminder that nations are built on belief, and belief doesn't stop physics. The old world flags told an even older story. Deeper in the Divide, past the marked men and the torn faction banners, the Courier found pre-war military installations still standing, commissaries with 200-year-old supplies, automated defense grids still online, and American flags hanging in sealed bunkers, protected from the wind. 13 stripes, 50 stars, the nation that ended the world. This was the infrastructure that made the Divide valuable in the first place. Pre-war missile silos, supply routes, automated systems that survived when everything else fell. The new California Republic built its expansion through the Divide on top of Old World roads. The Courier's package had reactivated Old World weapons, history repeating, symbols layered on symbols. Ulysses saw the American flag as the template for every mistake that followed. It had promised unity, democracy, protection, and then launched the nuclear missiles that killed 600 million people and turned the Earth into a wasteland. Every new flag, every new nation, every new symbol in the Mojave was just another version of that same lie, unless someone chose to break the cycle. The NCR was expanding under its bear. The Legion was conquering under its bull. Both were repeating the pattern, building towards the same conclusion: belief in the symbol, escalation, war, and fire. But the most important symbol in the Divide wasn't a flag at all. It was a delivery order, worn, folded, but preserved with the kind of care most people reserve for photographs. Ulysses had kept it through the detonation, through the tunnelers and the storms, through 6 years of waiting in the ruins. The package manifest listed detonation codes from Navarro, routed through the Divide's missile silos as a convenience stop on the way to the Mojave. Standard courier work. The signature at the bottom was the courier's own. Ulysses presented it not as accusation, but as evidence. "You carried this," he explained. "You triggered the launch sequence without knowing what you delivered, destroyed a community of 50 to 70 people, and walked away." The Divide became a graveyard because a courier didn't ask questions. This was the proof he'd promised at the end of EDE's logs. The crime wasn't malice, it was ignorance, the refusal to see consequences until they detonated. That confrontation was the moment every prediction pivoted on. Would the courier accept responsibility or deflect it? Ulysses laid out 3 paths with the precision of a man who'd rehearsed this conversation for years. First, convince him the Mojave deserved to survive. Prove through argument that NCR, Legion, House, or Independence represented a genuine future and not just another doomed symbol. Stop the launch through understanding. Second, embrace what he'd learned. Launch the missiles yourself, aimed at the Long 15 and dry wells, crippling both NCR and Legion supply lines. Accept that renewal demands destruction, that the old world's grip must be burned away before anything new can grow. Third, reject the lesson entirely. Fight him here in the Silo Temple, kill him, and stop the launch by force. Prove that violence solves problems, that might determines right, that the wasteland's survival depends on eliminating profits. Each option tested a different thesis. Dialogue tested wisdom. Launching tested conviction. Combat tested dominance. Ulysses had accounted for all 3 outcomes, built contingencies into the IBOT code and the silo access protocols. But there was a 4th option Ulysses prepared for, one that would prove his predictions incomplete. If the courier chose words over warheads, Ulysses shifted into interrogation. He asked them to defend their alliance. Why NCR's bureaucracy and taxes? Why Legion's slavery and crucifixions? Why House's autocracy and calculations? Why Independence and its chaos? He wanted reasoning, not slogans. The dialogue checks in Lonesome Road test speech 100 and barter 100, the game's highest thresholds. The courier had to demonstrate they understood taxation structures, supply logistics, cultural assimilation, technological monopolies. Surface-level answers failed. Ulysses had studied every faction for 6 years and knew their promises versus their patterns. This was the test of wisdom he'd designed. Could the courier articulate why their chosen path avoided the mistakes of the old world? Or were they just following another flag toward the same cliff? The answers had to acknowledge cost, trade-offs, the gap between intent and outcome. Ulysses listened for one thing: awareness that symbols become patterns, patterns become cycles, cycles demand interruption. If the courier understood that their faction's survival required breaking from history rather than repeating it, the philosophy held. The courier's ability to articulate their reasoning would determine whether Ulysses's entire philosophy was sound. The courier could push back. Through dialogue choices shaped by their actions across the Mojave, they could argue that Ulysses saw patterns where there was still room for choice, that the NCR's bureaucracy could learn restraint, that the Legion's structure could fracture without Caesar, that House's autocracy could be redirected, that independence didn't guarantee chaos. If the courier had spared enemies, built alliances instead of burning them, chosen mercy over expedience in their contracts, those actions gave weight to the words. Ulysses had studied the courier's trail. He knew whether compassion was a strategy or a principle. The argument wasn't that history didn't repeat. It was that people could recognize the repetition and choose differently. That awareness itself was the interruption Ulysses kept demanding. A nation built on old-world symbols could still forge a new path if its people understood what those symbols had already cost. Ulysses listened because the Courier wasn't denying the cycle's existence. They were proposing that individuals, acting with intention, could bend it, that his predictions, accurate as they were, assumed everyone would remain blind to the pattern. That challenge forced Ulysses to examine the one prediction he never wanted to consider. If the Courier's words and actions aligned, if their choices across the Mojave proved they understood consequence without needing catastrophe to teach them, Ulysses would lower his weapon. Not because his philosophy was wrong, because the Courier had become living evidence that it was incomplete. He'd predicted nations would repeat old-world mistakes. He'd predicted the bear and bull would devour each other. He'd predicted symbols would outlast the people who died for them. But he hadn't predicted that someone carrying those nations' futures could learn the lesson without needing the divide's fire to teach it. The student had absorbed the history, recognized the pattern, and chosen to interrupt it through understanding rather than destruction. Ulysses's method worked. His conclusion that it required nuclear winter to work was what the Courier had just disproven. The teacher's victory and defeat arrived in the same moment. Ulysses would stand down, deactivate the silo's launch sequence, and let the Courier carry the lesson home. The missiles would stay silent. The Mojave would face its future without the divide's warheads rewriting the question. But if the Courier chose violence instead, that would confirm everything Ulysses feared about the cycle. If the Courier answered Ulysses's philosophy with a rifle, they proved his darkest prediction, that when confronted with uncomfortable truths, humanity defaulted to eliminating the messenger. That dialogue was just preamble to the inevitable gunfire, that the wasteland's problems would always be solved the wasteland's way. The fight in the silo wasn't long. Ulysses had survived the divide's transformation, but he was still flesh under the duster. The Courier had crossed the Mojave, solving problems with violence often enough to make this familiar. Another contract, another target, another body added to the tally that stretched from Prim to the Strip. Even if the Courier stopped the launch afterward, manually locked down the missiles, and walked out of the divide, having saved both the NCR and the Legion from annihilation, Ulysses's point stood. They'd chosen to kill the one person who understood the cycle, rather than prove they could break it. The method was violence. The result was survival. The pattern continued. Ulysses died believing he'd been right. The Courier, the nations, the old world symbols, they'd all walk the same road until something bigger than a missile forced them off it. Either way, the divide confrontation would echo across the Mojave's future in ways Ulysses had foreseen. The divide went quiet. Whether Ulysses fell to bullets or walked away convinced he'd made his point, the outcome barely mattered to his thesis. The Courier had survived, which meant they'd carry every word of that conversation back to the Mojave, back to the war brewing at Hoover Dam. If the Courier had learned nothing, if they chose their faction out of convenience or spite or old loyalty, without questioning the cycle, Ulysses would be proven right from beyond the grave. If they broke the pattern, built something new, rejected both the bear and the bull, he'd still be right, because the choice itself had become conscious. The prophet wins either way when the question is whether you see the trap. But the divide didn't end at the high road. Ulysses had stacked one more test on top of the philosophy, one more way to force the Courier's hand, and it sat 60 meters underground in a concrete shell that had outlasted the world. The Second Battle of Hoover Dam would be the ultimate test of everything Ulysses predicted. The silo had been there the whole time, buried under the Hopeville ruins. Pre-war ICBM complex, Ashton Missile Silo, still functional because it had been built to survive a nuclear exchange and wake up afterward. Ulysses didn't just stumble on it. He'd spent years reactivating the launch systems, bypassing fail-safes, teaching EDE to interface with terminals that hadn't been touched since 2077. Getting the missiles armed took more than flipping a switch. It took codes pulled from scorched military installations across the divide, authorization sequences reconstructed from fragments, and a network of iBots daisy-chained to restore power to the silo's control center. Ulysses had turned the divide into a puzzle box, and solving it meant inheriting the keys to annihilation. The warheads were still live. 6 Mark the 7th ICBMs, 475 kilotons each, sitting in their tubes, waiting for launch authorization. Enough to flatten a city, salt the earth for decades, turn a capital into another divide. But the missiles were never pointed at the divide. They were pointed at the 2 places the Courier called home. 3 missiles locked on the Long 15, the highway connecting the Mojave to NCR's heartland. 3 more aimed at dry wells, the staging ground where Caesar's Legion massed its forces for the push west. Ulysses had rigged the silo to target the supply lines, the roads both armies needed to keep their war machines fed. Cut those, and the second battle dies before it starts. The launch protocol was simple enough once the Courier reached the control terminal. Authentication from EDE, final confirmation from a living human operator, 18 minutes until impact. No abort sequence, no recall codes. Fire and forget. Ulysses had bypassed every safety measure except one, the last biological check, because machines weren't supposed to make that call alone. He could have launched them himself, could have ended both factions before the Courier ever set foot in the divide, proven his point about old-world symbols by erasing their future in a single night. But he didn't. He waited, repaired EDE, sent the signal, dragged the Courier across the wasteland to stand in front of that terminal and choose. Ulysses left one hand off the trigger on purpose, because the decision was never meant to be his. The terminal offered 3 options. Launch the warheads at the Long 15 and dry wells, erasing both NCR and Legion supply lines in a nuclear rewrite of the Mojave's future. Stop the launch entirely, disarm the silos, and let the old missiles rust where they stood. Or redirect the payload back into the divide itself, burying Ulysses's lesson under 100 megatons of finality. Each choice carved a different scar into the map. Fire west, and the war at Hoover Dam loses its reinforcements on both sides. The Bears' army starves without California's roads. The Bulls' legions wither without the supply column from Arizona. Disarm, and the divide stays a weapon anyone could return to finish. Redirect, and the only thing left of this place is a crater hot enough to glow for 200 years. Ulysses watched. If the Courier launched, he'd try to stop them. If they disarmed, he'd accept it. If they turned the missiles inward, he'd see the poetry in it. The man had built the entire scenario to force a single question. Do you carry the violence forward, or do you break the cycle, knowing it costs you the leverage? But whatever the Courier chose down here, the road back to the Mojave had already changed under their feet. The divide didn't collapse when the confrontation ended. The storm still howled through the canyons. The marked men still dragged themselves along the highways, hunting anything that moved. But the path west opened again, and the Courier walked it the same way they'd walked in, 1 broken mile at a time. EDE flew ahead, scanning for movement. The iBot had seen the entire argument, stored every word Ulysses said, and never offered an opinion. Just beeped when hostiles got close, and played old Enclave recordings when the silence stretched too long. Somewhere in its memory banks, it still carried the message it was supposed to deliver before the divide tore itself apart. The Hopeville crater fell behind them. Then the high road through the collapsed overpasses. Then the fire stations and the apartments where the ghosts used to live, before the warheads turned them into walking epitaphs. Every landmark the Courier had fought through on the way in now served as a milepost on the way out. Quieter this time, emptier. The western gate waited at the end of the canyon, the same checkpoint they'd crossed weeks ago. Beyond it, the Mojave. But the courier who climbed out of that canyon was not the same one who walked in. The desert looked exactly the same. Novak's dinosaur still watched the highway. The 188 trading post still sold caravan lunches to travelers who didn't know the roads were about to close. The Lucky 38 still rose over the strip like a monument to a war that hadn't started yet. Nothing had moved while the courier was gone. But now, every settlement read like a sentence in Ulysses' argument. The boomers at Nellis, hoarding pre-war ordnance and calling it sovereignty. The kings, in Freeside, wearing the skin of a dead nation and pretending it made them whole. The Khans, up north, still flying the flag of a tribe Caesar had already written off. Each one a symbol that thought it was a civilization. The courier had walked into the divide chasing a contract. They walked out carrying a framework. Every conversation Ulysses forced them through, every historical comparison, every lecture on symbols and nations and the weight of a flag, all of it stuck. The man had spent 20 years watching empires from the edges, learning how they moved, what made them break, and he'd poured the entire thesis into the courier's head in a single night. But seeing the pattern is one thing. Carrying the man's entire method in your head is another. The courier walked out of the divide, carrying a lens nobody else in the Mojave had. Ulysses had shown them how to read the old world flags, not as decoration, but as anchors. How roads weren't just paths, but the sinew connecting nations. How every symbol carved into concrete was a promise someone made and then broke. It wasn't prophecy. It was pattern recognition, trained on 200 years of collapse. NCR expansion followed the same blueprint as pre-war America, right down to the overextended supply lines and the corrupt senators back home. The Legion's bull was Rome's eagle with a fresh coat of paint, and Caesar's synthesized Hegelian dialectic was just old tyranny, dressed in philosophy paperbacks. House's Vegas was a time capsule that convinced itself it was the future. Every faction thought it was writing a new story, but they were all reading from scripts the old world left behind. The courier could see it now, the bear's logistical ossification, the bull's cult of personality teetering on one man's heartbeat, the house's single point of failure sitting in a basement on the strip. Ulysses had mapped the weight-bearing walls of every power in the Mojave, and now the courier knew exactly where the cracks would form under pressure. But every strand of that framework pointed at one place on the river, and it was about to catch fire. Hoover Dam sat on the Colorado like a concrete fist, and by October 2281, every road in the Mojave bent toward it. NCR convoys rolled east out of Camp McCarran in columns that stretched for miles. Troopers in salvaged riot gear, marching beside Brahmin carts, hauling ammunition they didn't have enough of. The Legion massed across the river at Fortification Hill, 4 cohorts strong, waiting for Caesar's signal to cross. House's Securitrons held the strip and monitored approach vectors with pre-war targeting systems that never blinked. Ulysses had charted this convergence months before it happened. He'd traced NCR's expansion rate, Legion's conquest tempo, House's 200-year schedule, and calculated the exact window where all 3 powers would commit everything to the same 50 meters of riverfront. The variables were history, logistics, and ego. The equation solved itself. Now the courier stood at the center of it, with alliances nobody predicted and a platinum chip that could rewrite the board in 90 seconds. The Bears ranger stations reported Legion scouts on every ridge. The Bulls' Frumentary sent word that NCR's entire Mojave garrison was moving to the dam. House's Lucky 38 monitored it all from cameras the other factions forgot existed. The roads converged, the flags closed in. But armies don't win rivers. The thing that decided this one had been sitting quietly in Vegas the whole time. Then NCR brought 1,012 personnel to the second battle, spread across the dam itself, the visitor center, and the western approach. 6 ranger teams, 4 heavy trooper squads, 11 infantry platoons running on 60% strength after months of attrition across the Mojave. General Oliver commanded from the Hoover Dam offices with a radio link back to President Kimball in Shady Sands and absolutely no plan B if the line broke. They'd stripped Camp Golf, downsized patrols on Highway 95, and pulled every available body east. The Legion fielded roughly 850 warriors for the assault, plus support elements Caesar kept in reserve at the fort. Veteran cohorts in full lorica segmentata, recruit cohorts carrying machetes and football pads, centurions who'd burned their way through Arizona and expected the Colorado to be no different. Lanius himself led from the front with a blade that weighed 18 pounds and a reputation that preceded him by 40 miles. House contributed 94 Mech II Securitrons to the dam's defense under terms of the treaty with NCR, robots running software from 2070 that still outgunned anything biological on the field. The Courier brought whatever alliances they'd forged across 6 months of Mojave wandering. Boomers with artillery, Khans with vengeance, Brotherhood with power armor, remnants with enclave gunships, or none of the above if they'd burned every bridge on the way here. The math didn't care. It was already solved. But the bear had already spent more than it could afford just getting here. General Oliver had 6 companies at the dam, another 4 scattered across outposts from Searchlight to Camp Golf. Every rifle at Hoover meant 1 less at McCarran. Every trooper holding the line was eating supplies trucked 400 miles from the hub, through Raider territory, past the long 15's burnt-out checkpoints. President Kimball needed this victory before the next election cycle. The Brahmin barons needed the dam's power to keep their agribusiness running. The voters back home needed to believe all those body bags bought something. Oliver needed to prove the NCR could still win a war. So they stacked sandbags on the towers, dug in along the east bank, and waited for Caesar's Legion to break itself against concrete and 308 rounds. The plan assumed the enemy would fight like the NCR fought. It assumed Caesar would accept a loss. The watch rotation at 0400 was undermanned. The mortars on the Arizona side had decent range, but no spotter coordination. The NCR had air superiority in theory, but the vertibirds were grounded for maintenance. But across the river, the bull was betting everything on the opposite weakness. Caesar didn't need supply lines because his army ate what it conquered. He didn't need voter approval because dissent got you on a cross. He didn't rotate troops because legionaries either won or died trying. And the distinction didn't matter much to the war machine. Legate Lanius had 1,800 men in the first wave, another 600 in reserve, all of them conditioned to believe retreat was a worse death than anything the bear could offer. The doctrine was older than Rome. Fix the enemy in place, punch through the center, encircle and destroy. No radios meant no intercepted chatter. No vehicles meant no fuel logistics. No medics meant the wounded either walked or got left behind. It was rigid, brutal, and exactly as efficient as Caesar needed it to be for one single decisive engagement. The Legion had bet its entire future on this moment. If they took Hoover, they controlled Nevada's water and power. If they lost, there was no fallback position, no strategic depth, just a slow collapse back across the Colorado. Lanius assembled his centurions at 0530. By 0600, the assault horns were sounding, but a man in a lucky 38 penthouse had already calculated both of them down to the decimal. Robert House had been running probability matrices for 204 years. He'd predicted the Great War to the day, saved Las Vegas from annihilation, and spent 2 centuries positioning every piece for this exact scenario. The NCR and Legion would bleed each other at the dam, while his Securitrons secured the strip. The Platinum chip upgraded every Mark II unit in his network to military-grade combat capability. 97 Securitrons suddenly fielding missile launchers and Gatling lasers. The math was clean. Let the bear and bull exhaust themselves, then sweep in with overwhelming force and claim Hoover under New Vegas sovereignty. House's projections gave him 94% control of the Mojave within 5 years, 98% within 20, and a functioning spaceflight program within 50. He'd rebuilt civilization once already. This was just expansion of an established model, resource consolidation, backed by force projection and economic inevitability. Every faction leader, every supply route, every tactical weak point had been cataloged and analyzed. House had spent more time planning this battle than most nations spent planning wars. His only variable was the Courier, and even that was just a delivery mechanism, a wrench he'd hired to turn a specific bolt. But there was one player at this table House refused to account for, and it wore a courier's boots. Yes-Man grinned his unchangeable grin and handed the Courier every security override in New Vegas. The Securitron army upgraded, the Lucky 38 opened, and suddenly, the mailman who'd walked out of a shallow grave held more tactical cards than the Warlord and the CEO combined. The NCR had 15,000 soldiers, but a supply line stretched to Sacramento. The Legion had 10,000 hardened veterans, but no infrastructure beyond Fortification Hill. House had 5,000 Securitrons and total information dominance, but no human loyalty, only contractual compliance. The Courier had 287 caps, a Platinum chip, and the ability to reprogram House's entire robot army with 6 lines of code. Nobody saw it coming, because nobody thought to check if the delivery boy understood what he was delivering. Every faction assumed the Courier would pick a side and reinforce the existing power structure. None of them considered that the Mojave's future might belong to someone who owed nothing to any flag. But leverage means nothing until the dam actually erupts, and it was about to. October 19th, 2281. The Legion hit Hoover Dam's east intake towers at 0600 hours with 87 attack dogs, 200 Praetorians, and every piece of pre-war artillery Legate Lanius could salvage from the Arizona wastes. The NCR's first recon held the visitor center for 11 minutes before Centurions breached the lower gallery. Ranger Station Charlie went dark. Camp Forlorn Hope reported Legion scouts 400 meters out. The Long 15 choked with NCR reinforcements that would arrive 90 minutes too late, exactly as Caesar's supply interdiction had calculated. And somewhere in the chaos, a Courier walked the dam's crest with a detonator, or a holotape, or a speech check that would flip an entire army's allegiance in 45 seconds of conversation. The bear and the bull tore into each other across the Colorado, blind to the third player rewriting victory conditions in real time. This was the convergence Ulysses had seen from the divide's edge, the moment two empires burned their futures on a concrete monument to a world that died 204 years ago. But whichever banner rose over the dam, it rose in a shape Ulysses had already sketched in the sand. By 1430 hours, the dam belonged to someone. Legate Lanius lay dead on the east rampart, or he'd retreated across the Colorado, with Caesar's displeasure waiting in Flagstaff. General Oliver surrendered to superior force, or refused, and died at his desk in the visitor center. House's victor units enforced a new contract, or they didn't, their chassis smoking in the spillway. The Securitron vault at Fortification Hill came online, and 876 Mark II units rolled into Fremont Street, Las Vegas Boulevard, and every settlement from Good Springs to Jacobstown. The strip's neon flared brighter. The power grid stabilized for the first time since 2077. What Ulysses predicted wasn't who would win. It was that the Mojave would survive its victory, that Hoover Dam would become exactly what it was before the bombs, a symbol powerful enough to justify any atrocity, a concrete scar where ideologies came to prove they deserved the future. The Second Battle of Hoover Dam ended the way the first one did, with bodies in the Colorado and a flag over the turbines. The difference was what happened next, the slow unfolding of consequence Ulysses had been trying to prevent from 2,000 miles away. But a battle only decides who holds the ground, not what that ground becomes. If the Courier secured the dam for the NCR, the Republic annexed the Mojave as its seventh state within 18 months. New Vegas became a federal territory, its casinos taxed and regulated under Aerotech's emergency commerce codes. The strip that survived 200 years of raiders and chaos got zoned, licensed, and handed a property tax bill. The sharecropper farms expanded east toward Searchlight. Freeside got a garrison, then a curfew, then a deputy administrator for urban resettlement. By year 3, the Mojave sent 2 senators and 11 representatives back to Shady Sands, most of them Brahmin barons and casino floor managers who'd never seen the inside of a vault. The electricity flowed west through the same pylons that brought NCR troops east. The Republic stretched itself another 500 miles across desert it couldn't afford to defend, feeding a war machine it couldn't afford to stop. Hoover Dam powered California's lights, while the Mojave's water went to NCR-held farmland, at rates the locals never voted on. It was stability, the kind you get when the biggest army wins and writes the paperwork afterward. But the same victory that saved the Republic planted the seed he said would eventually bury it. If the Courier broke the NCR line and held the dam for Caesar, the Legion poured across the Colorado before the bodies stopped floating. New Vegas fell in 11 days. The strip burned, except for the lucky 38, which the Legion couldn't crack and eventually just ignored. The trading posts became staging grounds. Freeside became a kill zone, then a labor camp, then a training ground for the next wave east. Caesar's physicians bought him another 9 months with wastelander medicine and threats, long enough to see his banners over the dam, but not long enough to govern what came after. For those 9 months, the Mojave knew order. The caravans ran on time because the alternative was crucifixion. The roads stayed clear because the Legion put enough men on them to kill anything that moved without a banner. It was peace, the way a clenched fist is peace, and it worked exactly as long as the fist stayed closed. Lanius waited, Vulpes waited, Lucius waited. Every legate with 400 men and a territorial claim waited for the cancer to finish what the Courier started, knowing the Legion's law had no mechanism for succession because Caesar never planned to die. But a nation built to survive only one man cannot survive that man's fever. If the Courier gave House his chip and his army, the strip's neon never flickered again. The Securitrons cleared Freeside in 40 hours, not with bullets, but with employment contracts and property removal. House rebuilt the casinos to their 2077 specifications, using salvaged materials and wastelander labor, paid in caps and filtered water. Within 5 years, New Vegas looked like the postcard again, a working city with power, plumbing, and a police force that didn't ask for bribes because it didn't need money. House's projections called for spaceflight in 50 years, lunar mining in 100, and a technocratic republic that would make the NCR look like a tribal council. The Mojave got infrastructure. The traders got safe roads and standardized rates. The locals got jobs if they qualified, and relocation if they didn't, processed through Robco employment terminals that measured productivity in milliseconds and didn't care if you'd been squatting in that shack since 2 years after the bombs. It was the future, exactly the one House calculated in his isolation tube in 2077 and spent 200 years trying to restart. Clean, efficient, and utterly his. But a future run by one immortal mind has no room for the people living inside it. The third path was the hardest to name. No bear flag flying over the strip. No bull branded on every wall. Just Vegas, independent, belonging to nobody but the people who'd survived there. The Courier cuts every major faction loose, kicks House out of his own casino, and leaves the Mojave to sort itself out, without a government watching from above. It's messy. The kings hold Freeside. The followers try to keep people alive. And every settlement from Good Springs to Novak writes its own rules. No unified tax system. No shared military. No one vision of what tomorrow should look like. Just a patchwork of communities, deciding for themselves whether to cooperate or go it alone. Ulysses called it the one ending he couldn't chart with certainty. Not because it was unpredictable in the moment, but because independence has no fixed destination. You can model what Caesar does with total power, or what the NCR does with a Senate. You can't model what 10,000 people do when no one's giving orders. Freedom means the future splits into 1,000 branches, each one bending with every choice the wasteland makes. That's the beauty of it, and the terror. No empire to lean on, no dictator to blame, just people, and the consequences they build together. But an ending nobody can predict is exactly the ending Ulysses feared he'd built his whole philosophy against. So let's score the prophecy. Ulysses warned the NCR would overextend, choke on its own size, and fracture if it tried to hold the Mojave by force. In the NCR ending, that's exactly what the epilogue describes. Stretched garrisons, ration shortages, and the government losing control of outer territories within 4 years. He called it before the battle even started. He said the Legion would collapse the instant Caesar died, that the empire was one man's will holding back a civil war. If the Legion wins the dam and Caesar dies, the endings confirm total collapse. Legate Lanius can't hold the tribes together, and the whole war machine tears itself apart over succession. Ulysses saw the structural rot no one else admitted was there. He predicted House would centralize everything, treat people like variables, and build a future where freedom was the cost of survival. That's exactly the world House creates. Efficient, stable, and suffocating. The Strip thrives, the surrounding towns get annexed or ignored, and every human decision runs through one 261-year-old CEO who never has to leave his chair. Even independence, the path he couldn't fully map, played out in the zone of chaos he expected. No single collapse, no single triumph, just 100 small stories pulling in different directions. He got the broad strokes right on every major ending, down to the decade. But being right is cheap. The real question is how a broken courier learned to see this far ahead. Ulysses didn't predict the future by reading minds or running probability models. He read symbols. The bear, the bull, the robot king, the flag that never got planted. He treated nations like repeating patterns in history, old-world empires dressed in wasteland cloth, and he knew how those empires always ended because he'd walked through their ruins for 30 years. The NCR wasn't a republic making new mistakes. It was Rome in the late stage, spreading too far, taxing too hard, losing the loyalty of the people it claimed to protect. He'd seen that pattern in pre-war America, in the She remnants, in every government that confused size with strength. The bear wasn't special, it was just the latest cycle. The Legion wasn't a new empire. It was every cult of personality that ever marched under one man's name, from Alexander to Napoleon to the dictators that burned the old world down. Ulysses knew what happened when the man died, and the myth couldn't hold. He'd seen it in history books, and in the ashes of Denver. The bull was predictable, because it had always been predictable. House wasn't an innovator. He was a technocrat, playing the same game every pre-war corp played. The belief that one smart man could manage society better than society could manage itself. Ulysses had seen that hubris in Vault Tech, in Robco, in the government that launched the nukes. The pattern was 200 years old, and it always ended the same way. But the symbol he trusted most was the one hiding the deepest flaw in his entire prophecy. Ulysses didn't see symbols as abstractions. To him, the flag wasn't shorthand for the NCR. It was the Republic itself, stitched into fabric and flown over every outpost. The road wasn't infrastructure. It was manifest destiny, made physical, and when it broke, the nation broke with it. He'd learned that from the twisted hairs, where the pattern woven into cloth held the tribe's identity. And when the legionnaires wore those patterns as trophies, the tribe ceased to exist. That belief let him forecast collapse with eerie precision. If a symbol grew too heavy with meaning, too central to a culture's sense of self, its destruction didn't just damage morale, it erased the thing entirely. The bear expands, the roads stretch, the flag flies over too much desert, and the moment one thread snaps, the whole fabric unravels. He'd watched it happen to his own people. He'd watched it happen to the divide. But if history is just symbols repeating, then the West had already died once, and no one noticed the corpse. The cycle Ulysses mapped was clean. A group starts small, finds an identity, carves it into something visible, a banner, a road, a set of laws. Then it grows. The identity hardens into doctrine. The symbol becomes sacred, and overreach becomes inevitable, because the symbol demands it. The NCR didn't expand into the Mojave for resources alone. They expanded because the bear's territory is supposed to grow. The Legion didn't cross the Colorado for tactical advantage. They crossed because Caesar's map said Rome owns the river. Then the symbol cracks. The twisted hairs were scattered and their patterns stolen. The divide's roads were atomized in an afternoon. And when the symbol breaks, the people who built their entire identity on it don't adapt. They collapse inward because they never learned to be anything else. Ulysses had seen it 4 times in his own life. The twisted hairs, the Legion he joined, the NCR he served, the divide he called home. But he was convinced the same loop was already tightening around the Republic he'd watched from the inside. The West kept repeating because it kept rebuilding the old world. The NCR modeled itself on a pre-war nation that annihilated itself, complete with bureaucracy, taxation, and wars for land it couldn't hold. House wanted to restore Vegas to its exact pre-war glory, right down to the cocktail recipes and the neon. The Enclave tried to resurrect the government that launched the nukes. Every major faction in the wasteland was a cargo cult, reenacting the rituals of a civilization that had already failed once. Ulysses saw that as the core pattern. America built itself on symbols of progress and expansion, pushed those symbols past the breaking point, and detonated. Now the survivors were digging up the same flags, the same philosophies, the same hunger for territory, and calling it reconstruction. The machine that killed the old world was being assembled again, bolt by bolt, and no one seemed to notice they were building a bomb. But he'd found one thing in the wasteland the pattern couldn't quite swallow, and it unsettled him. The Courier was the error. Every other element fit the model. NCR built bureaucracies that collapsed under their own paperweight, taxation systems that stripped farms to feed distant capitals, expansion doctrines that pushed supply lines past the breaking point. The Legion forged trade roads and enforced tribal peace through systematic crucifixion, exactly the way Rome did before the Visigoths arrived. Mr. House wired his casino floor into a command economy where every cap flowed through one brain, one reactor, one aging life support system 200 feet under the Lucky 38. Even the smaller factions reproduced the old templates. The boomers isolated themselves at Nellis Air Force Base with pre-war artillery and a breeding population of 34. The Brotherhood locked technology in bunkers, while the world outside starved for water purifiers. And the Khans cooked chems in the same red rock canyons where they'd been cooking them since the 2160s. Each group believed it was building something new. Each group was laying the same grid over the wasteland that had burned 200 years earlier. Ulysses saw it all and called it recursion, the pattern of history copying itself, because people couldn't imagine a structure that didn't look like the one that had already failed. The flags changed colors, but the poles stayed planted in the same soil. But a prophet this certain had to explain the one man his prophecy never managed to place. He tried. In the logs he left across the divide and the tapes cached at Wolfhorn Ranch, Ulysses kept revising the courier's role in his grand pattern theory. First, the courier was a tool of history, a blind instrument carrying the old world's last bomb to the divide without reading the package. Then the courier became a representative of NCR expansion, the caravan culture that built roads and called it civilization while erasing everything that didn't fit the route. Later still, in the deepest holotapes hidden near the missile silos, Ulysses recast the courier as a force of chaos, a variable that moved between factions without joining any of them, destabilizing the very predictability his theory required. But none of those explanations held. The courier kept making choices Ulysses's framework couldn't anticipate. When he predicted loyalty, the courier walked away. When he predicted violence, the courier negotiated. When he predicted ideology, the courier shrugged and asked what the pay was. The pattern worked on everyone else because everyone else inherited a structure and defended it. The courier inherited a bullet to the head and a second chance with no nation attached. But the fault line ran straight back to a single delivery a courier once made without reading the package. That delivery destroyed the divide, and Ulysses spent years trying to encode the courier into a symbol system that could make sense of the destruction. He failed because the courier wasn't a symbol. The courier was a person who'd walked into the Mojave with no memory, no faction, and no script. And that absence of inheritance was the one thing Ulysses's pattern recognition couldn't parse. Every choice the courier made after Goodsprings rewrote the variables: help the Khans or destroy them, negotiate with the Brotherhood or bury them under their bunker, let Mr. House rule or pull his plug, side with NCR, Legion, or yourself, or walk away from the whole board and leave Vegas humming in the dark with no flag flying over the dam. Ulysses built a philosophy where history determined outcome, but the courier kept bending the outcome and forcing history to keep up. It wasn't destiny, and it wasn't random. It was 100 small decisions made by someone with no nation to defend and no old world to resurrect, just a package to deliver and a wasteland to walk through afterward. That terrified Ulysses more than any nuke ever did, because if the courier could choose outside the pattern, then the pattern was never inevitable. But if one person can break the pattern, then the whole idea of a fixed future starts to come apart. The game itself doesn't settle the argument. You can walk out of the divide having convinced Ulysses he was wrong, or having proven him right, or having put a bullet in him before the conversation finished. You can nuke the NCR, nuke the Legion, nuke both, or walk away and let the missiles rust. Every ending is canon to someone's playthrough, and the lore never confirms which future actually happened. That ambiguity is the point. If Ulysses is right, then your choices were always going to align with the symbols you carried, the faction you served, the pattern written into you by the old world. If he's wrong, then standing in the divide with your finger on the launch panel was the first truly free decision anyone made in 200 years. The game lets you argue both sides, then refuses to tell you which one won. What we know is this: the courier walks out. Ulysses, if he survives, stays behind to watch the weather and wait for the next collapse. The divide remains a scar, The old world remains dead, and the Mojave keeps spinning toward whatever ending you chose for it. But the man who argued hardest for fate was, in the end, still just a man, and the wasteland was about to remind him. If you talk him down, Ulysses becomes a companion. One more gun walking the long 15 with you into whatever war you're about to finish. If you convince him the Legion is the pattern, he'll even fight under the bull again. 20 years of exile erased by a single conversation. If you can't find the words, he dies in the silo, another prophet who couldn't see his own end coming. In some endings, he leaves the divide entirely and walks north, looking for new roads to measure and new collapses to predict. In others, he stays, treating the irradiated canyon like a monastery, waiting for the next courier to wander in and hear what he has to say. Either way, the Mojave stops listening. Whatever future he saw, whatever pattern he swore was inevitable, it's playing out now without him in it. The tragedy isn't that he was wrong, it's that he might have been right and it didn't matter. The war he tried to stop by killing you rolled on. The factions he said would collapse kept collapsing. The old world he wanted buried kept clawing its way back up. Ulysses spent 20 years walking every road in the West, and in the end, he was just one more voice shouting into the wind. But his fate was only the first of many. The wasteland was quietly settling in his absence. Caesar dies, not in every timeline, but in enough of them that it counts. A brain tumor the followers of the apocalypse could have fixed, left to rot because Caesar burned that bridge 40 years ago. If the courier doesn't intervene, if Arcade doesn't get dragged into the fort with a bag over his head, the self-proclaimed son of Mars dies screaming in a tent while his Praetorians stand outside, too terrified to admit their god is mortal. Launius takes over, the monster of the East, a man so violent that even Caesar kept him on a leash. Ulysses called this years before it happened. He knew Caesar's cult of personality was the only thing holding the Legion together, and the moment that personality stopped breathing, the whole army would fracture into warlords and succession wars. Launius doesn't unite the tribes, he just kills anyone who questions him. And that works. What Ulysses saw in the Legion's future was Rome all over again. The strong man dies, the generals fight for the throne, the frontier colonies realize there's no center anymore, and the whole thing collapses inward, like a burning tent. It didn't matter if they won Hoover Dam. It didn't matter if they took Vegas. Caesar was always going to die, and the Legion was always going to eat itself. But a dead bull leaves a herd, and that herd had to run somewhere. The NCR kept marching. After Hoover Dam, whichever way it fell, the Republic had 700,000 citizens spread across California and half of Nevada. They had farmers in Shady Sands and senators in the Hub and Brahmin barons who thought they owned the world. They also had supply lines stretched so thin that a single caravan ambush could starve an outpost for a week. Ulysses saw it before anyone else did. The bear's claws reached farther than its legs could carry it. Every new settlement cost more caps than it brought in. Every annexed town needed troops the NCR didn't have, and every year the taxes went up while the rations went down. By the time of Fallout 4 in 2287, travelers from the West talk about the NCR like it's already half a memory. The Republic didn't collapse overnight. It just got slower, meaner, more corrupt. The kind of exhaustion that turns a nation into a husk wearing its old uniform. Kimball's assassination, if it happened, sped things up. His survival just delayed it. Either way, the math was always the same. But every empire that overreaches leaves a strip of neon still burning behind it. Vegas didn't belong to anyone. Not really. The NCR held it for a year, maybe two, before the Republic pulled back east to shore up California. The Legion never took it, or if they did, they abandoned it the moment Caesar's tumor finally killed him. House might have kept it, if the Courier didn't pull his plug, or the Courier held it themselves and became something else entirely. But here's the thing, 20 years later, 30 years later, the strip is still there. The lights still work. The casinos still take caps. Travelers from the NCR and the Mojave and points east all say the same thing. New Vegas is the one place that doesn't care who won the war. It just keeps dealing cards. Ulysses thought symbols had power, and maybe he was right. The flag you carry defines you until it doesn't, until the wind tears it apart. But a city that survives by not picking sides, by being a crossroads instead of a capital, that's a different kind of symbol. One that outlives the people who try to claim it. But a city that survives everyone who claims it starts to feel less like a prize and more like a warning. The divide still stands, or doesn't, depending on how you look at it. The canyon's there, carved deeper by the warheads Ulysses spent years dragging out of silos and propping up like scarecrows. The marked men still wander through the dust, wearing NCR and Legion armor fused to their skin by radiation. The wind howls through snapped overpasses and half-buried supply depots that once ran from California to the Colorado. It was supposed to be a nation. Ulysses said so himself. The divide wasn't NCR or Legion. It was something new, built on the old roads the Courier walked without knowing. Then one package, one detonation, one accident, and the whole thing went up. 6 warheads buried under the divide came to life because the Courier carried a payload they didn't understand. Ulysses turned it into a sermon. He spent years in that canyon talking to a man who wasn't there, rehearsing a speech about symbols and flags and how the old world died because it forgot the weight of its own messages. But the divide wasn't a parable. It was a graveyard, and the only people who remember it now are the ones who walked out. But the roads out of the divide never stopped running. They just changed who they carried. Ulysses understood roads better than anyone in the wasteland, not just as cracked asphalt or courier routes, but as the thing that makes civilization possible and vulnerable at the same time. A road connects 2 places, carries supplies, ideas, people. It makes you stronger, but a road runs both ways. The Twisted Hares learned that when Caesar's legion followed the trade routes straight into their canyon. The divide learned it when a courier from the Mojave delivered a device that read the old missile codes still sleeping under the ground. Connection is salvation, and connection is the knife that finds you in the dark. Ulysses spent years walking every road west of the Colorado, mapping the routes between New Vegas, the 111 Four, Nipton, Searchlight. He knew every caravan schedule, every patrol pattern. He was looking for the structure underneath the chaos, the way the old world had built itself on highways and supply lines. And he found it. The roads were still there, still shaping everything. But the same lesson had already been carved into a canyon far to the north, in blood. Joshua Graham spent 7 years in Zion Canyon after the Legion burned him and threw him into the Grand Canyon. He'd come to protect the sorrows and the dead horses from the Whitelegs, but he came carrying the same poison Ulysses would later carry out of the divide. The belief that history is a loop, that war is inevitable, that the only choice is who survives. Daniel, the other missionary, begged him to evacuate the tribes instead, to run, to let go of Zion, to choose mercy over another extermination. And if the courier sided with Daniel, Joshua listened. He walked away from vengeance, let the Whitelegs take the canyon, and led the sorrows to safety. It's the only time in the entire Fallout universe Joshua Graham chooses peace. Ulysses never got that moment. He had no Daniel, no courier to pull him back from the edge of his own certainty. He stood in the divide with his finger on the launch button and asked you to help him burn the future, because the roads always led to the same place. But Zion proved they didn't have to. The roads go where you walk them. But the ghost that haunted Ulysses hardest wasn't in Zion. It was still choking on cloud in a poisoned casino. Father Elijah died in the Sierra Madre's vault, sealed inside with all the gold bars he'd spent years obsessing over. He'd dragged 4 people into that casino, collared them, and forced them through the cloud and the holograms because he couldn't let go of the old world's treasures. The entire message of dead money is in the final room. You can take the gold or you can leave alive, but not both. Ulysses never met Elijah, but they're the same man. Both former brotherhood, both brilliant, both so haunted by what they lost that they turned into monsters trying to resurrect it. Elijah wanted the Sierra Madre's technology to wipe the slate clean and rebuild civilization his way. Ulysses wanted the Divide's missiles to destroy the NCR and the Legion so something better could grow. Same obsession, same refusal to let the past stay buried. The Courier in Dead Money learns to walk out of that vault empty-handed, to let go, to begin again. But Ulysses never walked into the Sierra Madre. He never heard Christine's voiceless warning or saw Elijah's corpse rotting next to his precious gold. He stood in the Divide, gripping his own pile of warheads, and called it philosophy. But letting go was never Ulysses' real problem. The men who rebuilt his mind in a dome had planted something worse. The think tank never stopped running their experiments. In the big empty, those floating brains kept testing, dissecting, theorizing, totally blind to the world their toys had burned. They'd scooped out Ulysses's brain once, filled the cavity with lobotomite programming, and when he broke free, he spent the rest of his life proving he wasn't one of their products. But the pattern was everywhere. The Sierra Madre's collars, Zion's tribals worshipping a burned man, the Divide's missiles waiting under the ground. Every corner of the wasteland carried some old-world machine, still running its program, still convinced the experiment mattered. Ulysses walked between them, like a man checking traps, reading each one for proof that history followed rules. The Big MT watched it all from its crater, its sensors cataloging data no one would ever read. Those scientists had turned themselves into ghosts in jars, immortal and useless, the perfect symbol for a man who couldn't stop searching for meaning in the rubble. They'd rebuilt his body in their dome and sent him back out, and he'd spent 200 years trying to prove the surgery didn't take. 4 roads, 4 lessons, 4 laboratories, where the old world's logic still flickered in the dark. But all 4 roads led back to one traveler, and the wasteland had already started turning him into a story. In the years after Hoover Dam, caravan drivers started telling a story. A courier who walked the Divide and lived. A courier who'd destroyed one nation, saved another, maybe founded a third. The details shifted with every telling. Some said he wore the flag, some said he burned it, some swore he never existed at all. NCR troopers whispered about the soldier who'd held the dam alone while their commanders slept in clean beds. Legion Frumentarii traded rumors of the profligate who'd broken Lanius with nothing but words. In Freeside, they talked about the killer in the Lucky 38, the one Mr. House had been waiting for, the wild card no one saw coming. Every version cut away the doubt, the reloads, the messy choices that didn't fit the shape. The legend compressed 6 months into a single golden thread. A courier, walking from Goodsprings to the dam, like some wasteland messiah, with a path no one could block. It left out the trial and error, the failed speech checks, the times you walked away because the quest was bugged. Legends don't have save files. And somewhere in the Divide, Ulysses heard the stories and recognized his own voice in them. He'd been predicting the courier's rise since before the two of them met, shaping the myth with every message left on a torn flag. But a legend is just a prediction pointed backwards, and that symmetry is not an accident. Because here's what Ulysses understood that everyone else missed. The Mojave's future wasn't being written by NCR supply lines or Legion strategy or House's probability matrices. It was being written by the stories people told about what was possible. Every campfire tale about the Courier made the next courier more likely. Every song about standing at the dam made the dam worth dying for. The bear and the bull spent their whole histories thinking nations were built on guns and supply chains, on holding territory and grinding forward 1 mile at a time. But the Mojave remembered different. It remembered Elijah, the elder so obsessed with technology he became a ghost. It remembered Joshua Graham, the burned man who wouldn't die. It remembered a courier shot twice in the head who walked to Vegas and broke the game. Ulysses had wrapped himself in symbols because symbols were the only weapons that actually scarred the wasteland's memory. You could kill a legion, burn a city, crack a dam, and in 50 years, nobody would remember which side you fought for. But a man carrying a message through a radioactive storm, a man who forced a nation to hear him, that story doesn't fade. It mutates, spreads, finds new hosts in every caravan that rolls through Prim. So Ulysses was right and wrong in the same breath. His prophecies came true because he'd spent years hammering them into the shape of a myth, and myths are contagious. He'd predicted the Courier would define the Mojave's future, and the prediction made itself real by turning one random mailman into the only story anyone told. But if stories make the future, then we have to ask what a prophecy really is. Ulysses didn't see the future. He read the past until the pattern was so clear that forward and backward started to look the same. He walked every mile of the old world's roads, mapped every supply line the Legion and NCR built on top of them, watched both empires make the exact mistakes Rome made 2,000 years ago. He knew the divide would explode because he'd seen the warheads still sleeping under the ground. He knew the Courier mattered because he'd watched one delivery reshape an entire region's war machine. He knew Vegas would survive because House had already survived 200 years on nothing but spite and a working computer. What looked like prophecy was just pattern recognition sharpened to the point where it cut through time. He'd done the work. He'd logged the miles, read the logs, excavated the truth from layers of sand and lies until cause and effect were as visible as roads on a map. The discipline was so total, it looked supernatural. But every prophecy carries a quiet assumption that tomorrow has already been decided. So here's the question the lonesome road forces you to answer. Is the Mojave's future locked in by the weight of history? Every choice, just a link in a chain, the old world welded shut? Or is it actually open, one courier's decision enough to snap the pattern and start something new? Ulysses argues for fate. The bear will overextend because empires always do. The bull will fracture because Caesar's dying and Rome collapsed the moment Augustus did. Vegas will endure because it's built on the one resource that survives every war, the human need to forget. History is a groove, worn so deep you can't climb out. But the game hands you a detonator and says you can end the cycle right here. You can stop the NCR's expansion, cripple the Legion's supply line, erase the divide's lesson from history entirely. One person, one choice, breaking 200 years of momentum. The lonesome road doesn't tell you which argument wins. It stages the fight, sets both sides at your feet, and waits. But the games themselves quietly cast a vote, and it lands on the side Ulysses feared. Because here's what New Vegas actually shows you. The Mojave's future isn't fixed, and it isn't free. It's a wager between history and choice, where the house edge shifts every time someone refuses to play the expected hand. The NCR should win because they've got the resources, but one courier can starve their supply lines until the weight advantage means nothing. The Legion should collapse because Caesar's mortal, But if you keep him alive, or ensure Lanius learns restraint, the pattern breaks. House should rule, because he's got 200 years of prep time, but you can delete him with 3 mouse clicks, and the probability curve doesn't care about his business plan. Ulysses was right that history is a hammer, and every choice you make is a nail it's already swinging toward. But he missed that the Mojave isn't Rome or Washington. It's too broken, too remote, too tangled in old-world tech that still half works to follow a clean pattern. The roads run, but they don't run straight. So the future is both. History is real. The groove is deep. The mistakes will repeat unless someone does the work to break them. But the break is possible. One traveler, one route, one refusal to deliver the expected message, and the whole system has to recalculate. But there's a reason this one traveler could break a law of history, and it isn't in the wasteland at all. It's you. The Courier isn't just a character in the Mojave's story. They're the one person in the entire wasteland who sees it the way you do. Every location is a choice. Every faction is a variable. Every ending is a branch you can walk back and rewrite. Ulysses knows this. He talks to the Courier like someone who understands they're not bound by the same rules as everyone else, because they aren't. The NCR repeats itself because that's what the NCR does. Caesar repeats Rome because that's the only story he knows. But you can walk into the Lucky 38, hear Yes Man's pitch, and decide the whole deck is marked. When Ulysses says you carried the package that destroyed the divide without knowing it, he's not just talking about a delivery. He's talking about the unconscious power of someone moving through a system without reading the text. And when he says you can still choose, he's speaking directly to the only person in the Mojave who actually can. But behind Ulysses stood a writer using him to say something about the whole franchise. Chris Avallone wrote Ulysses as an argument, not with the Courier, with Fallout itself. By 2010, the franchise had become a pattern. Vault opens, world is broken, factions fight over the same bones, player picks a winner. The NCR is the Enclave, is the Brotherhood, is another flag claiming another ruin. Lonesome Road was built to ask whether any of it mattered. Whether saving the Mojave just sets up the next disaster, whether the old world symbols, repainted and carried forward, are progress or just another turn of the same burning wheel. Ulysses survived the divide and spent years walking the breadth of the West, looking for a nation worth the name, and kept finding the same scorched infrastructure wearing different coats. The DLC doesn't just tell you this. It makes you walk the road that proves it. The Sierra Madre, a tomb built by pre-war greed. Big MT, old-world science, still running its experiments on nothing. Zion, tribal war, using pre-war theology as justification. The Divide, a courier route that became a crater because nobody checked the payload. Every location is a warning that the old symbols are poison if you don't change what they mean. But if the pattern is real, then the warning was never aimed at the Mojave. It was aimed at us. Because we do it too. We rebuild the same systems and call it progress. We take the symbols that broke us, the logic that burned the world, and wear them forward because they're familiar. We vote for the faction that looks like order, even when the order is a meat grinder with a photocopied constitution. We call it civilization because it has a name and a flag, and we don't ask what it's built on until the horizon starts glowing again. Ulysses saw it in the NCR, in the Legion, in the Divide's courier network that nobody thought to question. He saw it in you, the one variable that could break the pattern, and he couldn't tell if you'd even notice you were repeating it. That's the warning. Not that the Mojave will burn, that we'll light the match, call it a torch, and keep walking the same road because we don't recognize the pavement anymore. The old world didn't end because of bombs. It ended because no one stopped to ask if the destination was worth the route. And the new world, built on its bones, is walking the same line with the same certainty. Ulysses spent 6 years trying to find a single road that didn't loop back to the divide. He never did. But warnings are heavy things to carry alone, and Ulysses had been carrying his for a very long time. The twisted hairs gave him a name based on the roads he walked. The Whitelegs wiped that tribe out while he was away, carrying NCR orders. He wandered the wastes for years after that, marking X's on every place that used to mean something, trying to make the pattern explain why it happened. By the time he reached the divide, Ulysses had rebuilt himself as a student of symbols instead of a member of a people. He studied the old world, not because he loved it, but because its corpse was the only teacher left that wouldn't die on him. The Courier's package detonated that classroom, and for 6 years, he wandered the divide's storms, watching his last refuge collapse in slow motion. He turned his grief into a thesis about nations and flags, and the violence baked into every road the old world left behind. It was elegant, it was complete, it made the pain make sense. But underneath all the philosophy was one small choice a courier could still offer him: to put it down. Ulysses predicted the NCR would choke on its own supply lines, and by 2281, Chief Hanlon was falsifying reports because the brass wouldn't listen. He predicted Mr. House's Vegas would survive on pre-war infrastructure it couldn't replace, and the Lucky 38's reactor still runs on parts Robert House installed in 2138. He predicted Caesar's Legion would die with Caesar, and even Lanius admits the East is barely holding after the Courier walks away. He saw it because he walked it. 15 years, crossing the same roads, watching the NCR stretch from Shady Sands to the Colorado, watching Vegas shine on stolen water, watching the legions carve toward the dam. He understood the method, the pattern of how old world roads shape new world powers. His blind spot was the one thing the old world couldn't teach him, that a single person could choose to break the loop. The Courier proved history bends when someone refuses to let it repeat. Hoover Dam, the Mojave's future, the divide's missiles, all of it came down to whether one person would keep walking Ulysses's pattern or step off the road entirely. He'd built a cathedral of theory about inevitability and collapse, and it held against every test except the one standing in front of him. But the whole towering prophecy comes down, in the end, to something almost embarrassingly small. It's a conversation. 2 couriers in a missile silo beneath a shattered highway, and the choice is just whether Ulysses keeps carrying his thesis or sets it down. If you talk him off the launch, he helps you at Hoover Dam, then disappears back into the wastes. If you don't, the divide stays a wound that never closes. Either way, the prediction was right. The West's future did hinge on understanding the old world's mistakes, on knowing that roads built for empires will always invite new empires to march. Ulysses spent 15 years learning that lesson, and 6 more trying to teach it, and the only student who listened was the one who'd walked far enough to see it without him. Thanks for walking this road with us. If you want more deep dives into the Mojave's factions, characters, and forgotten corners, subscribe or check the playlist. There's a lot of wasteland left to cover, and we're not done mapping it yet. In the end, if you convince him, Ulysses plants his old Legion and NCR flags in the divide's dirt and sits down by a fire for the first time in 6 years. No nation to rebuild, no thesis to prove, no road calling him forward. Just a man with a worn duster and a pack that finally weighs nothing, watching the smoke rise into the Mojave sky.